Hey guys, Matt here. Before we start this episode, I just wanted to take the time to say thank you to everybody who has listened to TRP over the past month. As of the day of this episode releasing, we will be 1 day shy of 30 days, and in that time, we've had 276 people listen across Spotify, Amazon, Apple, and YouTube. And that's not even counting the folks who have listened on Facebook, because the analytics on Facebook are kind of vague. What I do know is that the posts on Facebook have been seen by over 1,600 people and engaged with by at least 1,200 of those folks. I use engage with in air quotes because Facebook doesn't exactly help with understanding what exactly engagement means, but I do know that it means that it's more than just being on their feed and they scroll past it. It's somebody taking the time to look at it or click on it or comment or like or something like that. And honestly, as the creator and operator of TRP, all I can do is record and edit and release the episodes and do what I can to help the episodes get in front of people, and God will handle the rest. All of that to say, it's reaching people. People are listening, and I know that if you are listening to this, clearly, that means that you are one of those people, and I wanted to say thank you. Not just for listening, but for all of the feedback from people that I never expected to listen to the podcast. And I hope that if you've listened to this, there's been something there for you. In my mind, the kind of metric for success was really just if one person hears it and there's something there that they need to hear, then that's worth it. And I think the future is much bigger than that. And I honestly think that the podcast has already done more than that. But all of the people who have taken the time to reach out and share their comments and their observations and experience with the podcast, it just means so much to me. So thank you so much. And if you want to continue helping TRP, honestly, the easiest and simplest way that has the most impact is just to like, comment, share, subscribe on the whatever platform that you may be listening to. It really helps not just with, sharing it with the people that you are immediately connected to on social media, but it also affects the algorithms of the different platforms and helps it get in front of people through, their Facebook feeds or through their suggested feed on YouTube, Spotify, etc. So if you want to help, that's honestly the biggest way you can. It doesn't cost you anything, just a little bit of your time. But with all that out of the way, really what I want you to do is right now, sit back and relax and enjoy this episode with honestly one of my favorite people in recovery. Thank you guys. Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Recovery Podcast. On today's episode, my co-host will be my wife, Natalie, and we'll be talking to Carol Hoelle, a person integral in starting and growing the Celebrate Recovery in South Lebanon, Ohio, that so many of us have found freedom and family in. Carol will share her story and walk us through how God can use even unfair circumstances to help us surrender to our higher power and find genuine peace and purpose. And sometimes, that purpose includes so much more than we could have ever imagined. Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Recovery Podcast. My name is Matt, and we're going to do things a little bit differently today, and I'm pretty excited about it. So let me start. Let's do our housework, our disclaimer first, and that is how we start every episode by stating that anybody on this podcast who shares from their experiences from whatever recovery program, whether that be AA, NA, CR, Al-Anon, whatever, nobody is a representative or spokesperson of the program they choose to share their experiences from. That said, we absolutely do encourage everybody to share from their experiences from the recovery program, but this is our way of trying to accommodate the spirit of anonymity the best that we can on a public platform. So with that out of the way, like I said, my name is Matt, and a few people have come up to me and they've said, hey, we love the podcast, or we hate the pod. Nobody said that, but they might. But like, hey, we like the podcast, but we noticed there aren't any women on there. And that is on purpose, but not for the reason you think. So don't cancel me. I'm not a misogynist. But the kind of the issue that I wanted to be very conscious of is doing everything above board. So making sure, like when I do these podcasts, it's just me and the other person alone in a closed room for a couple hours. And just for the sake of doing everything above board, I didn't feel like it was appropriate for me to do a one-on-one podcast with somebody of the opposite gender. And on top of that, I feel like it'd be better for like I relate more to another guy. You know what I'm saying? And I feel like there's more relatability between the same gender. And so, with that said, I want to introduce for the very first time my wife, Natalie, who is co-hosting with me today. And what I'm hoping is that eventually she will spread her wings and fly away from the nest, and she will do her own episodes. But I am here as the awkward third wheel of this conversation. But so Natalie, just go ahead and introduce yourself to everybody and do like a brief introduction about yourself.
All right. So I'm Natalie, a grateful believer in Jesus Christ who struggles with anxiety, control, codependency, and PTSD. And I am grateful to be here.
Awesome. And then why don't you go ahead and spread your wings a little bit and introduce our guest today?
Yeah. So I am super excited to be able to spread my wings with a dear friend and mentor, Carol Hoelle.
Hi, Carol.
Hi, guys.
Tell us a little about yourself, Carol.
My name's Carol, and I'm a grateful believer, and I struggle with codependency, but have found freedom from drugs and alcohol through Jesus Christ, my Lord and Savior.
And Carol, so Carol and Randy might be the two people that I've talked about the most on the podcast, but have not been on yet. So you're famous already on the TRP podcast.
Wow, I don't get
You're
to be in lights.
This is our first celebrity guest. But Carol and Randy, they lead the Celebrate Recovery at the Village Church, where we all attend, and have been a big part of my recovery journey, and I know have been a big part of Natalie's recovery journey. So I've been looking forward to having you on, and I'm looking forward to having Randy on at some point too. But let's just to kind of get us the ball rolling. Why don't you just tell us, kind of give us? Let's do it this way. Let's start with you getting sober, and then we'll work our way back. We'll do a little Quentin Tarantino style chopping back and forth. Do you have a definitive moment where you engage in sobriety?
Well, that's a good question, Matt. So I initially got sober in April 8th of 1993 and was clean and sober for about 12 years, but failure to enlarge my spiritual life, I ended up going back out, not drinking, but going back out and doing cocaine because, I was an alcoholic. I wasn't a drug addict. So it was okay for me to use drugs. So that was, so I was out for a few years and ended up getting in trouble with the law. And ended up spending some time in my home away from home, better known as the Hamilton County Justice Center. And as a result of that stay, I ended up, it was during that time that I got a clear message from God. And the message is that he was with me, he knew me, and that he knew the truth about my addiction. And I think it was during that time in Hamilton County Justice Center that he spoke to me that changed my life.
So, sorry, there was like a bumping noise. I don't know what that is.
Not quite sure.
Oh. I think it was my foot.
Carol. Carol has enough energy for, like, she puts our kids to shame. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt.
What was your life like back then? What was your family dynamic when all that happened?
Both my husband and I were in addiction together. And as I said earlier, I got caught by the law. And as a result of that, I ended up getting clean and sober. And my husband was still in addiction for 5 more years. But we had 4 girls living at home during this time. And my husband was left at home with to raise 4 girls, a full-time job, and an active cocaine addict while I was on my hiatus at the Hamilton County Justice Center.
So is that like the Marriott? Sorry.
It's a little better than the Marriott, Mac. Come on.
Okay. Dude, I guess it depends on what Marriott you go to. So hearing you talk about that, that's not that different of a timeline than Natalie and I with our recovery journey where Natalie, well, I'll let you tell it. So let's take a moment and just talk about how we got into CR.
How you got me into CR?
Yeah.
So Matt and I got married in June, and that September is when he overdosed. And I was completely shocked. And being the codependent that I am, I was supporting him in everything that he needed to do, and that meant coming to Celebrate Recovery. So I knew that if I went, he would go. So that's kind of what brought me into the walls in the beginning.
That's how they get you.
Yeah.
That's how they get you. If you're codependent, that's how they trap you at CR.
Yep. I was going to save him, right? And then realized how bad life was for me. But through the grace of God, we are still married, and I have a deeper relationship with the Lord and have found so many freedoms in my life.
So Carol, as so you've kind of hit your rock bottom while you're at your hiatus.
Correct.
At Hamilton County. And at that point, where was your, I know that your faith is the foundation of your life now, and you're heavily involved at the Village and Celebrate Recovery being a Christ-centered program, but where was your faith at that time? Like where was your engagement with God around that time that you were?
Prior to going to Hamilton County Justice Center, I believed in God and I knew there was a God, but I felt as though he did not want anything to do with me because of all my shenanigans in the past. And it was during that time, my stay at in the Hamilton County Justice Center, that I came to realize that God wanted a personal relationship with me. I never knew anything about a personal relationship, and it was during my time there that I started developing that personal relationship through early morning just devotions, Bible reading. There was a group of us that would meet on a regular basis and read the Bible. And it was a time I had that I could ask a lot of questions. And looking back on it, I think God, they always say God disciplines those he loves. And I think he just plucked me out of the world and put me into a place where I had to be still, be quiet, and that I could hear him.
So talk a little bit more about the circumstances that led, because I know your story, but it's been a while, so I don't want to lead things the wrong direction. But prior to you really engaging with recovery, surrendering fully, you had already kind of been going through the legal system, correct? And was it a false positive?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I was in the legal system and I was doing everything that I needed to do and to meet the requirements of my probation. And I got a call. I had 3 urine screens right in a row, and the following, let's see, and that was like a Thursday, Friday, Saturday that I had the 3 urine screens right in a row. And on that following Tuesday, my probation officer called me and said, hey, you need to be in court on such and such a date. And I'm like, why? And she was like, well, you have a positive drug screen for cocaine. And I started to get defensive, kind of plead my case with her. And she said, well, obviously you're not working recovery or you take this news better. Well, I knew what that meant because I had 6 months hanging over my head. And I knew in my heart that I did not use cocaine. And when I went home and told my husband, who was in active addiction, remind you, he was like, well, just get packed up, get your passport, and go to the south of France, and I'll meet you with the kiddos in a couple months. And remember, that's coming from someone in active addiction, their theory, just run.
Right.
However, I called my sponsor, and my sponsor said, well, you're lucky you didn't get what you really deserved. You got yourself in this mess in the first place. This is just consequences. Suck it up and do what you have to do. So I went to court, and right away I had a paid attorney, and the judge was like, asked no questions and just said, that's it, 6 months, and sent me to 1617, which is a recovery part of the Hamilton County Justice Center.
So imagine you're trying to do the right thing, but you're not engaged in recovery quite. You haven't surrendered yet. You're starting. You're willing to be willing. Is that what would you say? That's a
I think I was a little more than willing to be willing because I was going to recovery meetings every single solitary day. I was an outpatient at that time, doing outpatient, and I would say maybe I was just one smidge ahead of willing. Maybe I was straddling the fence. I had 1 foot in and 1 foot out.
Well, I mean, you're living with chaos, right? Living
Correct.
with someone else in addiction. So you can only work so much in that environment. So the blessing was God removing you so that way you had no other distractions but to surrender 100%.
Yeah, correct, Natalie.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the process that most of us, when we look back on our recovery journeys, a lot of us have that definitive moment of surrender, right? And I've talked about it in my story, and then yours, and I mean, everybody that's been on the podcast has mentioned, like, this is the time when I was like, I give up. But there's a process to get there, right? Like, there's as my sponsor, Mitch, there we go, as he said, like, just sometimes having the willingness to have willingness is where we start. The faith the size of a mustard seed, and from there, it's a journey. God has to typically kind of walk us through some more pain to get to that point of surrender. But with yours, you're doing the right things. You're starting to work recovery. You have a sponsor. You're not using, and so I mean, that had to. How did you feel? I mean, when you got that. I mean, what was going through your heart? What was going through your mind when you got that news? Because you're trying to do the right thing, especially contrasting with, I was not doing the right thing getting up to here. Now I'm trying, and then I'm still getting punished. Like, how did that feel for you? What was that? What was that like?
I was crushed. There's no other way to describe it other than I was crushed. But it was through the tools that I had already learned in the program that when I called my sponsor, she was able to help me process it and say, hey, this is you I chose to use cocaine illegally, and this is part of the consequences of my using.
Right.
Although using when I started many years before.
So I don't know, maybe I'm projecting here, but typically when my sponsor has a response like that and it's not what I want to hear, I'm just like, man, I never should have asked you.
Exactly. That right. Yeah. I can't say it during this podcast, but I did have a few choice words for her.
It sounds like, though, in talking with you in the past, that you did have this almost supernatural peace when that happened as well. Was there a struggle with that of, because a lot of us in recovery, we come to the point where we're finally caught, right? And it catches up to us, and there's some freedom and relief in that. Was there anything like that at that point?
Not at that point, but when I did get into the pod at the Hamilton County Justice Center, and I was sitting on the stairs and crying, and it was like I was crying out to God, like, no one believes me, no one trusts me, everyone thinks I'm a liar still. And that's when I heard God's voice just so clearly say, I know the truth, and I'm the only one that matters. And at that point was life-changing for me, because I was able to embrace where I was. I was able to embrace just and move forward being in a lockdown facility.
So when you have that moment, you hear God speak to you so clearly. In recovery, we call that a moment of clarity, and it's even more so when you feel it, when it comes from your higher power.
Mm-hmm.
And so what is life? What is the process after that? So you hear that, and then, I mean, first of all, that moment when you hear it, are you experiencing relief? Do you feel a burden lifted? What's kind of going through your mind as you hear that?
Yeah, well, in secular recovery, they call it a spiritual awakening. Mm-hmm. And I feel like at that moment, sitting on those steps, and I still can visualize it perfectly to this day, and 18 years later, and it was the weight of the world had been lifted off my shoulders. It was just like, I don't have to worry about what anyone else thinks, because God knows the truth.
Mm-hmm.
How far into your sentence were you when this happened? Was it fairly quickly?
That was the first night of a 6-month sentence.
Did you stay for the full 6 months, or did you?
I did 3 months in 1617, which is the recovery part of Hamilton County, as I said earlier. And then I was able to complete the last 3 months in a lockdown halfway house. Mm-hmm. So although at the halfway house, there was, of course, a lot more freedom because I was able to wear my own clothes, and we got real meals, and we worked in phases in the halfway house. So once you got to a certain phase, you were able to go out on a pass. So I was able to see my family. I was able to go to meetings outside of the halfway house. Part of the process there, it was mandatory that I got a job when I was in the 4th phase. So I was able to get released to go to work. And so it's almost like transitioning back into society after being taken out of society.
So as you're going through this process, what's going on with your recovery and your relationship with God? during that 6-month process? How does that look like from you, going from the night that you have your spiritual awakening to the moment you release? What is that process like for you?
Well, I wasn't, although I grew up Roman Catholic, I wasn't taught a lot about the Bible. I knew of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and I attended religion class every day. However, I wasn't really taught what was in Scripture and what Scripture meant. So, fortunate enough, in the 1617, there was a group of women that were very knowledgeable on the Bible and and had a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And those women met every morning before breakfast at 6:30, and there would be about 8 of us in this little room off in a corner that would meet. And it was just a time that I was able to dig into Scripture and ask a lot of questions of individuals that knew more about the Bible than I did. So it was a time of really a lot of educating, being educated from individuals that were familiar.
Mm-hmm. So what about like the recovery part of that? I know you said that you were able to eventually go to outside meetings. Was there meetings going on while you were inside too? I'm assuming that's like the recovery wing that you spent, or the recovery pod that you spent the first 3 months, right?
Yes, you from 8:30 in the morning until 10 at night, you were being educated on different topics of recovery. Every evening they'd bring someone in from the outside, from AA or NA, that would give a lead or hold a meeting, an open discussion meeting. And there were some times that we'd have a group of women that would just get together and just have a meeting on our own. And one of the things God really used me and there was a girl that she and I became friends. However, she had trouble reading. And so she would always ask me, "Can you read the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous to me?" And so she and I would sit in the evenings when we had a free time or downtime, and we would read, I would read the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous to her.
So was that your recovery program, the fellowship that you were the most engaged in going into this?
Into recovery, yes. It was Alcoholics Anonymous, and I also attended Al-Anon as well.
Okay. I'm not super familiar, just to take a little side road here. What is the difference between, like, like Al-Anon specifically, how is that, like, what is that program like? Like, if you can just give me like a short synopsis.
Let's see. Well, Al-Anon is based on, for me, it was taking care of myself as opposed to taking care of the individual who's in addiction. Mm-hmm. So it was more of like, what can I do to keep myself safe and sane in this environment that's so chaotic of living with someone in addiction.
I got you.
It's a codependent. It's a codependent's dream, right? So it's
correct.
A codependent created it. We're gonna.
Yes.
I don't know that for sure, but
no.
To me, it's, hey, here's a group about what you can do to help yourself when you're in a situation where somebody else is hurting you. So you get to be selfish, but you're doing it for someone else, not for yourself.
All recovery programs are selfish in the only way that's good, in the sense that you're focusing on you. But is that really what Al-Anon is more focused on?
Yes, it's taking care of yourself before you try to take care of the qualifier, I guess, of the individual who's in addiction.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. It's about detaching from that, being able to live with that individual, but detaching from them in love. Mm.
Okay. That was good, because it's Al-Anon's, I hear that, I've heard it, mentioned before, but I'd never really looked into it.
Mhm.
So I appreciate you taking the time to educate me.
Yeah, and Al-Anon really, as Natalie said, it's about codependency.
Gotcha. Okay. Um, so you're engaging with Al-Anon and Alcoholics Anonymous, and um, I've said before, I actually have never been to an AA meeting, but I have the big book and I still read it. Like I love it. Charlie Hartman, when he was my sponsor, I cannot English today. Sponsor. I can't say sponsor. Monster sponsors. Anyways, when he was my sponsor for a brief period of time, we actually didn't do the CR books. We did the big book, and that was my first introduction to it. And I was kind of like, I remember we met, and I was like, what are we doing with I'm not in AA. And then we got into it, and I was like, man, this is good stuff. Especially that back half is really good.
The information in the Alcoholics Anonymous Blue Book is invaluable.
So as you're engaging, when you were in the recovery pod, I'll just call it that, and because I can't remember what the actual number for it.
Yeah, let's forget it. That's all right.
If you tell me, I'll forget it. Yeah,
that's all right. I'd like to forget it too.
So did they have like a specific recovery program set in there? Was that more of just a general recovery?
It was AA.
Okay.
Yeah, Alcoholics Anonymous, and also Narcotics Anonymous.
Okay. Yeah. So you're really in a position of head education. You're learning. You're ingesting, all of this information, and then as you, which I think is important. We all have to go through that, right? Like there's there's the head knowledge that we have to. It's just as important as making sure that we take as the experiential knowledge that we learn, because between those two things, that's how it gets to our heart.
Mm-hmm.
So as you're going through this process and you're engaging with that, and your faith is growing at the same time. You go through the 6-month process, and then you get out. You still have to come home to a husband who's in active addiction. How was that? Was there culture shock being back in that, back fully immersed in that environment? And then, so it's the first question is, what was that experience like coming back? And then, how was your experience taking all of the information that you learned and applying it to your life?
So coming back into my house, there definitely was. I wasn't sure where I fit in, for one. Although I walk in and I have 4 kids. Mom, we're so glad you're home. A husband in addiction. My house was spotless and everything was so organized. Hence my hubby's addiction. He had a lot of time on his hands.
And a lot of energy.
A lot of energy,
Right.
Exactly. More so energy than time, I think. Yeah. So that was it was tough. I remember feeling like a stranger in a house that I had lived in for 15 years. However, I just kept doing the next right thing. I leaned a lot on my sponsor. I attended a lot of meetings. And at that point, I was still working a job. In order to get out of the halfway house, I had to work a 30-hour job. So my days were pretty busy from getting back adjusted to kids' school schedules and going back to that role as being mom and all the responsibilities that come along with that. And then I had a job that I still was working and also attending meetings on a regular basis.
I mean, that's trial by fire.
Oh,
for somebody,
absolutely.
And I know that you had been engaged in recovery before you went in, but I mean, as far as truly engaging in that full surrender with recovery, I mean, that is trial by fire. Not only dealing with yourself, but also dealing with living with somebody in active addiction. So what were the, specifically with pertaining to living with Randy being in active addiction, what were the challenges in that for you?
Well, the challenges were that there was a lot of chaos around me.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew that I did not want the chaos. I had just came out of a life of chaos of my own, and to walk back into it was difficult. However, that's when I started attending Al-Anon, because I was working a 12-step program for my own recovery, and then going to Al-Anon of how to live with someone in active addiction. And so I really believe that I was so busy that I didn't have a lot of time to think about the challenges that were going on with him and our relationship, because I was so busy in my own recovery, and not only recovery, but with being a mother again, a full-time mother, and picking up all the responsibilities.
I mean, I can't imagine how hard that is, right? So you go and you have the transition with the halfway house and everything, but nothing can prepare you for going back into full-time mom mode, being married to an addict, trying to work a recovery program, trying to have a job to stay in the house that you have with your family. Like, talk a little bit more about that. How did you focus on your recovery with all of the other stuff happening around you?
Well, it's kind of funny that you should mention that, because I would take my kids to AA with me.
Started young.
And it's funny because even now, one of my daughters, Casey, she'll be like, "Oh, I remember him from the AA meeting," and so I would take my kids to AA with me. The three younger ones, the older one was kind of doing her own deal, but the three younger ones would go to recovery meetings with me, and it really was, everyone welcomed them with open arms.
So did you guys have a conversation with the kids? I know they're resilient, so they know more than what we think or want them to know. But was that a transparent conversation growing up for them, or?
Well, as a matter of fact, Randy would bring my girls to 16, 17, or the recovery pod, as Matt calls it, which I like that name a little bit better. No, but anyways, I had visitation Monday, Wednesday, and Sundays, and Randy would bring my girls every Sunday to visit me. And when I was in jail, and I mean, and now, 18 years later, my girls are grown, and the youngest being 22, the oldest being 36, and we look back on it and we can all laugh about it. But they had a favorite song they would play on their way there to visit me, a song by U2. Is that the name of the group? Yeah. That they'd all come in and talk to me, as Randy says, talk to their mother behind the glass.
Mommy's on display.
Yeah, exactly. In her beautiful khakis.
But what a blessing that is, though. I mean, I know being involved in CR, we see families all the time. And there's so many, and I work with teens now, and it's the parents that aren't being transparent about the situation and the trauma that causes. And one thing that I've noticed from watching you and Randy is the full transparency with your kids. So just a side note of praising you for that, of saying, like, it's very motivational, inspirational for us to see what that does to the generations.
Yeah,
after addiction.
That's interesting, Natalie. Thank you. Because when I was in Al-Anon, when I was attending Al-Anon, there was an individual in the meeting, and I said, "What do I tell my kids?" And she said, "Whatever you do, you do not lie to your children, because it is going to come out at some point, and you would rather be open and honest with them now than them having to come to you and say, no one ever told me. Why didn't you? And then it causes resentments and bitterness and anger in our children. There was no need. So yeah, we were very open and honest with them, and even to the fact of we just, when Randy was still in addiction, we just talk about him being sick and he needs help, and that we can love him through this process.
Yeah, it's tough to, because sometimes, like, especially when you have younger kids, and your kids, how old was your youngest at this time?
Sorry. Well, let's see.
I didn't mean to catch you mid drink.
Let's see. I have 18 years of recovery, and my youngest is 22, so 4.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously, especially when you have a range of children,
Yes.
There's a challenge of, like, your 4-year-old won't be able to comprehend everything. So there is a certain virtue to not overloading them, right? And putting something on a plate, on a 4-year-old's plate, that maybe your oldest could understand. That's a different conversation. And I know for Natalie and I, our kids are fully, and we never talked about this, but I do know that when we think about having our children also immersed in recovery, that we thought about you and Randy. At least I did, and it sounds like Natalie did as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so we do. The kids here are regular at CR, and
we just starting the process early because we know how jacked up we are. We're like, we'll just start now.
We are monitoring it for sure. We're like, we know how this goes, and
Step 1.
Yeah. And listen, like, I mean, honestly, like, there is, if you take a very objective, bird's eye view of how things affect children, I am, my mom was an addict. There was addiction going on my dad's side of the family, on my mom's side of the family. And so, like, there is a pattern of, like, there is a tendency that follows you, whether it's, part of it's genetic, physiological stuff. Some of it's might be spiritual. Some of it might be behavioral, whatever it is. There is a chance, there's a higher than normal chance that our kids might struggle with something.
Oh, correct. I can look back in my family history and see there's a long generational line of individuals in my family with addiction.
Yeah, and so having, for us, I know it's important. I realize that with our kids, there's only so much you can do with anybody, but as parents, like, eventually, our kids are going to be old enough to make their own decisions, and whatever decisions they make, if one of them or both of them, hopefully none of them, it does end up going down that road. I want them to know the same thing that I knew, that when I was out, that I always knew I could come back here. I always knew that. And because of people like you and Randy and Bob and Daryl and all of these people that I had seen examples of recovery working. And so, our kids, whatever choice, whatever decisions they make, whatever path they decide to take, I want them to know that no matter, even if it's not drug addiction, if it's just dealing with life on life's terms, that there is a way to process that. There's a healthy way to engage in that's not destructive.
Well, the reality is, whether addiction isn't the problem, it's a solution.
Right.
So, and everybody has their own problems, right? Or their own solutions. And so what 12-step and particularly Celebrate Recovery does for us is it creates a toolbox of resources. It creates a family outside of, mom and dad, grandma and grandpa. This is a true forever family where it's, what, I can come in and I can be totally down on myself and have a terrible day, and I've got people that are waiting for open arms. Or I can totally have just hit rock bottom, went back out, slipped up, and it's, hey, I'm so glad you're here. And I think it's so important for me to be able to have that for my kids, because it takes the pressure off me, right? I'm putting other people in it, and so teaching them and showing them that there is a godly community, a godly family. Like, this is what the Bible says, that we are brothers and sisters.
Mm-hmm.
And when you walk in the rooms of Celebrate Recovery, that is exemplified better than anything that I could have ever described to them or shown them. I mean, it's a tangible love experience that's found through Jesus, through grace that's given by him and him alone.
Well, and I think people around the rooms of Celebrate Recovery all welcome one another in our brokenness. You walk in, it's not like you have to have it all together to be here. It's like, oh, you're jacked up? Great, come on in. We love jacked up people.
That's right. You have found the spot for you.
Yeah.
We also love the people that don't know they're jacked up.
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah, I mean, I I joke, right, that like that's how they like a lot with, and it's almost it's uncanny that it's the exact same story almost with people who struggle specifically with codependency that come through CR, is that a lot of times they come to support somebody in addiction, and that's the point that that's how they get you, like that's how we trap you, because it's, if you're here long enough, it's going to be impossible to not take a glance at yourself and say, what part of this is going on with me? Not because anybody's here to judge you or that anybody's going to beat you over the head and wag their finger at you and tell you that you're doing something wrong, but because if you're around people in recovery who have experienced real change and transformation, and you're like, at some point you're gonna be like, I want what they have. Like when I was, the reason why I part of the reason why I couldn't write off recovery when I was, and specifically CR, when I was in active addiction, is that I looked at people like you and Randy and Bob and Daryl and my list of I think Mitch calls them recovery heroes, but examples, but examples of people who, like, the program works. And I look at that and I'm like, they have something that I want.
Well, they give you hope.
Right. Right. And I'm like, listen.
And it's not that they don't struggle still. It's the peace and the weightlessness of the struggle, if that makes sense. Like, their burden isn't heavy. It's not defeating. It's not daunting. It's manageable. And I think that that's what the Walls of Recovery help create. And it's just creating a place where, I can come and, it's normalizing struggle, because we can't deny that struggle is there. Struggle is always going to be there. But it's creating that place where we can see people living life and living joyful life with struggle.
Well, and on top of that, it's not just that we normalize the acceptance of the struggle, but that we also make it readily apparent. Because if I came up to you and I said, Carol, I want what you have, you're going to point me, you're going to say, you work the program, you show up and engage, and you
suit up, show up, and be a service.
That's right. That's right. And everybody will tell you that. Everybody. Mm-hmm. If I ask Mitch, or if I ask Randy, if I ask Daryl or Bob or whoever, they're all going to say some version of the same thing, is that is show up, engage, and the key part of what you just said was be of service. And kind of going back to our kids, and this is me kind of putting my dad hat on, I tend to think about, when I think about the kids and what I want for them, I recognize through recovery and also through the examples I have through, like, my grandparents, who are, when I think of somebody who embodies service, it's my grandparents. Mm-hmm. Is that how key being willing and able to be of service to somebody is so vitally important. And it's kind of something, because we in recovery and in church, we kind of cater, I don't say cater in terms of trying to, like, demean, but there's always somebody new somebody getting started, somebody that needs it. And so a lot of the message and a lot of what we talk about tends to be, this is how you get started in recovery, or this is how you start engaging with Christ. But the one thing that has honestly kind of been an effortless part of the Village and of CR is service is just natural. It's something that we do really well. But it is absolutely vital in recovery, especially that you be of service, because that's it. You can't. Something is being given freely to you, and if you want to keep receiving that thing, you have to give it away.
Give it away, correct?
And so,
yes.
That.
Well, and it gets you out of your own head, right?
So exactly. It gets you out of that echo
even if
chamber.
you don't, even if you're not, you're not realizing that you're doing, or even if your motivation is simply for yourself, God uses that, right? And so whatever the motivation be, acting in service is going to fill you and someone else. So that's what makes recovery work. It is a selfish program, but it's not a selfish program. It's selfish in the fact that you're doing this for yourself, but as a codependent, it's easy for me to wrap my mind around, okay, and I know like with my past trauma and stuff, if you will use my hurt to help someone else, I will take any other pain that you have for me or any other residual pain that will happen. But if I can get in that mindset of like, God will use that pain and then walk it out, that's huge. And that's what recovery is. Recovery is leading by example. And the only reason we lead by example is because we've surrendered to the Lord and just said anywhere, right? Anything, anytime, anywhere, Lord.
And it's a selfishness, in terms of, and I've said this before on the podcast, that I work on me because out of me flows everything else. Out of me taking care of me, my capacity as a husband and a father and a servant and as an employee and a brother and a friend, sponsor, whatever, podcast host, apparently now. All of those things, none of those things are possible if I'm not.
If you're not working on Matt, if we're not working on ourselves. And, that's, part of it, that, the selfishness we're called to share our experience, strength, and hope. And that's how we share it is by, we have to, I don't know what I'm saying right now. I just lost my train of thought. We have a dog barking in the background. Sorry.
Yeah. This is not, I feel like none of us have a high attention span at this table. Maybe the dog should be on the podcast and then we'll be good. We'll focus. So that was a good conversation, but just to get us back on track, kind of going for us. I know. At what point did Celebrate Recovery kind of make itself known in your life?
Oh, geez, God has such a sense of humor. God was all over our family. And I'll just give you a little background story. Our neighbors had moved, and the individuals that bought our neighbor's house happened to be he was going to be Jeff Sharp, the associate pastor of a new church plant called Rivers Crossing. And so I had gotten to know Jeff and his wife, Sarah. I had shared that I was in recovery, so on and so forth. Not a lot of details. And as a matter of fact, one Monday morning, Jeff once Rivers Crossing had launched, I had started attending there. And on a Sunday, I don't even remember what the teaching was on, but I do recall thinking, oh yeah, I'm well aware of that. I learned that, when I was in jail, and it just so happened that, and Jeff had no idea that I had been to jail. He knew I was in recovery. And so that was on Sunday, the sermon at Rivers Crossing. And then on Monday morning, Jeff and I are walking, grabbing our recycling bins. And I started talking to him about whatever the sermon was on or the teaching that. And I said, we talked a lot. I talked a lot about that when I was in jail. And all of a sudden I was like, did I just tell him I was in jail? I was like, whoops, my new neighbor, he's probably thinking, who the heck did we move in next to?
Right.
Jailbird.
And I actually did look at him and say, did I just say that? And he just grinned. But anyways, Jeff, after about, I'm trying to think, Jeff and Sarah had lived next door to us for a couple years, and out of the blue one day, Jeff said, hey, are you familiar with Celebrate Recovery? I'm like, no, I'm not. And he was like, well, look it up, check it out, look it up on the internet. And I did. And so Jeff had said, well, I'm going to attend a training out at Saddleback in California, and I'd really like to bring it back here and get it started. So I guess it was like 2009, maybe 2010, Jeff had gotten some people together. There were, I think, 7 of us that he knew we were all in recovery, and we met. And he did like a 2-hour training with us and said, there you go start Celebrate Recovery.
And that's how it started. Did we know what we were doing? No, but it definitely was God led, and it started out real small right here in South Lebanon, and eventually at the old Salvation Army building. And once I started doing Celebrate Recovery, and we just met on Saturdays at that point, Saturday morning. And then as we grew, we eventually added the Wednesday nights. And since we added the Wednesday nights, there was a debate, should we get rid of Saturday? And it was like, no, because that's where we really became established. And that's where the Saturday Open group
Yep, that's
came
where,
from.
and that's what it was.
Yeah, and that's when I started coming. I remember I'm pretty sure my first meeting was at Salvation Army down right down the road from where we're at right now. What? Why are you shaking your head?
Because I don't think that.
Yeah.
Because we moved.
Honey, listen, I know this is shocking, but I actually went to a recovery meeting before we met.
Dang.
Yeah.
Learned something new.
Yeah. I remember that.
You're just testing out the waters.
I think the first time I went, Mike Ruskowski,
he was going for someone else.
No, Mike. Actually, I was. Yeah,
that's how it works,
dude. But not for that reason. Somebody had a big impact on me when I first started attending Rivers Crossing. Mike Ruskowski led worship. And I think that I tagged along with him, and then. At that point in my life, I had a few things, like pornography was something that was kind of hanging around, and but that was way before I engaged with drugs and alcohol. And man, what a crazy seed that was planted there. Like God was like, "You're gonna need put this in your back pocket, buddy. You're gonna need this later."
Yeah, here you're just dabbing your toe in, but you're gonna put both feet in at some point in your life.
So, as you attend. Celebrate Recovery, and I don't want to get too much into Randy's part of it because I want him to share his own story. But so as you start attending Celebrate Recovery, what is the timeline with that to where Randy starts coming and he goes through his process of finding recovery?
It was several years, yeah, and even Randy would come to celebrate recovery meetings with myself. However, he was just coming to appease me.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't for himself, but he was just coming. So I'm trying to think. It probably was a good 3 years. If I'm not real sure about the timeline, but I bet it was about 3 years before he eventually got clean.
Did you have any resentment during that time?
Natalie, what kind of question is
Well,
that?
because I know that God can provide supernatural grace, and sometimes the resentment doesn't happen until after our addict gets clean and sober.
Mhm.
So I had no resentment before, and 2.5 years post sobriety, the resentment's coming up, and I'm like, where the hell is this coming from? Like because I realize, and what the Lord is really working on me with is this is what God has told me, is I needed you to be there as much as you could be. And so I held that back from you until it was time that you could do it yourself, because you were carrying the load of a family and working ministry and working a job and all of these things. And so now it's like, okay, God's like, all right, now let's work on you. So did you have a time like that when you were in ministry and then post recovery with Randy?
I can't, of course I had resentments while Randy was in addiction, but after he got clean, I was so relieved that he was given a second chance, because there were times when I really questioned whether or not I would ever see him again. I think I was so full of, so relieved that I was just so grateful to God that he had did this miraculous work in my husband's life, and I had a husband back. Our girls had a father back, and I still to this day am, all glory to God, because it was a miraculous work and that God had done in him. But as he was in addiction, I had a lot of resentment and bitterness during that time. Fortunate enough, I was working 12 steps of recovery for myself and for Al-Anon, because so I was doing CR for the 12 steps for myself, and then Al-Anon through secular recovery. So I had both going on at the same time.
It's something that I don't really think it's talked about a lot in recovery, and that, resentments do get talked about, but not in terms of like CR, especially when you work a step study and you learn how to do that, work that through your inventory and amends and all of that. It teaches you how to deal with them. But one thing I've noticed is that resentments, like, people carry them in different ways. Like, not everybody handles resentments the same way. And so I know, like, a struggle that Natalie and I have is, and we're kind of going through this right now, is my 2.5 years. I drug her through 10 years of me using, and then including scaring the crap out of her with my overdose and just being a miserable dick, to put it frank.
Good choice of words.
Yeah, but yeah, I know that God gave her a supernatural grace God provided for her what she couldn't provide for herself in that time.
God did for her what she couldn't do for herself.
Amen.
But there was and there was definitely like that pink cloud period when I got sober where everything was great. But after that, we've gone through this process of unpacking resentments and hurts and things that I caused her that were no fault of her own, and hurts and resentments that I have and towards her, and things that I'm going to shock everybody listening to this, but in order to have a marriage, there has to be people involved. And where there's people involved, there's going to be
issues.
hurts, and there's going to be resentments, and there's going to be things to unpack.
Yeah.
Now, what nobody signs up for when they start working recovery is that I've heard the saying that there's nothing worse than a belly full of alcohol and a head full of AA.
Correct.
Well, the same thing that applies to hurts, habits, and hangups and resentments and all of that when you're in recovery, like in CR, where in any recovery program, but specifically, speaking to CR, where we don't get the luxury of just not dealing with those things anymore. If you were engaging in recovery, if you want to live life on life's terms, you have to deal with it. And so that presents its own challenge because, like with Natalie and I, we have very different approaches of how to deal with things. I am direct and blunt, and I would I would rather somebody scream in my face what they're mad at me about than to deal with any kind of
quiet.
Than any kind of stonewalling or passive aggressive. It drives me crazy, and that's not Natalie's. Like, you deal with things different than I do, and so
because my program tells me not to react, and so that's how. And I'm not. That sounded like a dart. It wasn't meant for a dart. I promise. It's just the way that, because it is so, we view things so differently when it comes to processing, and so in the beginning, I had to learn how to not react. Like, I have to learn how to process first. And one of the best pieces of knowledge that Carol has given me is true forgiveness is not bringing up the past. And so my natural tendency when that happens, when, we are in an argument or discussing the resentment, is to not be like, well, you
want to throw that in his
always.
face.
And so it's and every time I hear Carol sing, true forgiveness is not bringing up the past, and I'm like, son of a gun, Carol.
I don't think she's a fan of you in those moments, Carol.
but it is.
That was a teaching moment.
But it's true, and I think it's, now getting back to your story and your marriage, being in recovery with your spouse. You learn different ways to go through things and being on different recovery journeys. So, you are parallel in your recovery journey. So you've got the alcohol and drug addiction, but you also have the codependency piece. And I think that the codependency piece is such a hard concept to understand, especially as women, because it's what the world says that we should do.
Right.
We should take care of people. We are the last to, we are to serve, right? And we put all of our value into that. And so there's
into taking care of.
Exactly. And so when you're in that codependent recovery, it's learning that, yes, I do need to take care of others, but the detachment and love, which I think you brought up with Al-Anon, that's a huge piece when it comes to recovery for codependence is how do I do that? What does that look like? So can you talk about one time in particular where that was just very apparent, where that was like,
or even in general, like I think even, an example would be good, but even in general once you guys both started engaging with recovery, like, did you guys at some point address the past together and kind of unpack and kind of talk through?
Well, yeah, both of our past, because we both had a past, we were in addiction together, but also there was a lot of separation in our addiction too, because when you're in addiction, you're going to do what you have to do in order to do what you want to do. So yes, we would use together, but we'd also use separately a lot as well, which we both created a lot of a mess, together and individually. So when we both got clean and sober, when we were parallel, when we were both on the recovery journey, there's so much stuff to unpack. I mean, and we were in addiction for several years together. And I mean, there were some hard truths that we had to look at, and I remember some very painful conversations that we had to have. And it just is painful, just painful conversations that we had to look at some of the damage that we did to one another. I mean, it wasn't only about doing it on inventory of where we write that down, but it was looking, sitting down face to face with one another and say, hey, I really, messed up here. And, yes. And I mean, it's still, and we still have to do that today in our everyday lives when we mess up,
Mess up?
Yeah. Because we're human. So I don't know if that's what you were asking or if that made sense.
No, I mean, it's because that's a part of it that, while we do in CR, we go through the amends process, and they teach you, do a step study, by the way. If you're in Celebrate Recovery, if you haven't done one, let me go ahead and just throw that out there.
Yes.
It'll change your life to have that in-depth experience of learning how to work the 12 steps like that.
And not only learning how to work the 12 steps, but it's a great way to recognize why we do what we do in the first place.
Yeah.
Yep. And so, but that process looks different for everybody. It's the same process, but it's going to look different depending on who you're doing that process with. And so, especially as a married couple, with a history of kind of all this baggage that comes along with dealing with codependency or dealing with addiction or dealing with both people or whatever the circumstance may be, it's a longer process. I feel like when, and this is speaking from my own personal anecdote, with Natalie and I, but I feel like it's a pretty common thing that it's a long process because there's so much because you have so much history when you're living with somebody else that it takes some time. And on top of that, you've also got to continue living with that person. So,
well, the amends process looks different too when you're married. It's not like hey, this is what I've done. It's not like let's go have dinner, let's talk about this, and the easy like, okay, and then we can depart. Well, we can't really depart.
Right.
I mean, you can, but not really. And so it's continual living amends. And I think there's always, or what I've learned is, the things that I've written down for an inventory, that's not all of it. And there's things that I don't even know. And I truly believe that that's the Lord's blessing on that, of giving us what we can handle at the time.
Absolutely.
And him guiding into deeper relationships, because then it's like, all right, so now that we've got that one out of the way, let's talk about this one. So it's living out the amends process. It's not a,
Right. Being a living amends is the best form of amends there are, because when you live it out, your behavior has changed toward that other person.
Yeah, and there is no better arena for living amends, more better set of circumstances for living amends than with your spouse. And it's not a pretty process all the time. And
But
I look over it, man. I'm glad. Sometimes when I do this podcast, I'm glad there's not a video portion. Like, I've thought about doing video, and then I looked over at Natalie, and Natalie's looking at me. She's shaking her head like, "No, it's not." And I'm like, "Okay, if I ever needed confirmation that I was right about something, there it was right there."
But it does get easier.
Yeah,
yeah.
And the fact, the thing about it is, even in the difficulty, of doing a living amends, and then also sprinkling in some actual verbal amends in there, is that it builds in recovery. Like, yes, there are ups and downs in terms of I like you or I don't like you right now.
But I love you always.
But with and I'm gonna speak to Natalie. In my experience with Natalie and I is really, I mean, living amends in this is that, like, no matter how difficult it gets, as we work through things, it's one more brick to that foundation. And so even in the moments where we are not in accord about something, we disagree about something, we're arguing about something, I know that I still love her, and I'm going to take a stretch here and say that she still loves me. I don't know, but
We're still married.
yeah, but I know I have this hope because of recovery that no matter what we're dealing with, that however painful this may be to work through something, that when we get through it, it's going to make our relationship stronger.
Stronger, absolutely.
And you know, obviously, I don't know the ins and outs of your everyday with Randy, but I can tell by example that between you and Randy that has happened. That's example.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And after, well, Randy, I think just celebrated 12 years in recovery.
Ooh, Randy.
And
you just had an anniversary not too long ago.
Yeah, December 18 years. And it definitely, the more we work the program and work on ourselves individually, the better our marriage is.
Right.
Yeah. And that's the beauty of the work in the 12 steps, is because when I am disturbed, what is it inside of me that's causing the turmoil? I have to take responsibility for what's bothering me. I can no longer point the finger and shift the blame.
Yeah, it's tough to navigate it too, of how to deal with. I didn't know this was going to turn into a couples therapy session. Maybe we should call Randy and be like, "Hey, you need to get in here.
I was going to say that.
We're talking about
bad.
you. We're talking about you." No.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, we'll talk about this later. But I would actually love to do an episode not only with Randy and I individually, but you and Randy and Natalie and I together. But
Yeah, that'd be
maybe we'll call it couples therapy.
Dr. Matt.
but it's tough to navigate, and I don't do well with this. This is something that I struggle with, of how do I communicate a behavior that's bothering me or circumstances bothering me that involves Natalie or any. I struggle with this with anybody, but it's especially harder when you're living with somebody. How do I struggle? Like, the one part is I need to take ownership of my part of it, and I can't finger wag and I can't dig. But at the same time, like, learning that tension of, I want to be able to communicate an issue. I don't want to be a jerk. I don't do those things well. There she is, nodding again.
He's working it.
I feel like we need a narrator, like a play-by-play. Like, and Matt spoke and Natalie nodded her head in agreement.
You pause, pray, and proceed.
Yeah, these are all. This falls under the category of living life on life's
terms. Correct. Yeah.
And so to get us back. And to your part of it, and to your story. So you're attending. Were you a leader at CR before? Like, because when it started, take me back here. I know it's in detail. It's a detail. It's not really important for you, those of you listening. I apologize, but it's important for me to kind of to harken back to the origins of Celebrate Recovery. But I know Julie was there.
Yeah,
Julie McGuire.
Yeah, I was Julie McGuire, Bob Motts, Jody Johnson, Greg. I forget Greg's last
Kirby.
name.
Right?
No.
Greg Peterson.
Greg Peterson.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, Natalie. Greg Peterson.
Oh, that's a great dude. I got to get him on here.
Tim Clark, and then myself. And then Jeff was kind of overseeing it initially. Yeah.
So eventually you stuck around long enough that you became a leader at some point, right?
Oh, I was a leader at that point.
Oh,
at the
I was,
beginning.
I
Oh,
was-
wow. Yeah.
I was the original.
Man,
Jeff Sharp
I have
just
some-
handed that to her with a big old bow on it and said,
Man,
"This
I
is
don't-
great program. Here you go."
Jeff's got some
But
questionable judgment, let me tell you.
He does.
But-
Dang on that guy.
We're joking, but in all seriousness, like if there is a person that can be more inviting, it's Carol. Because she just lives out transparency. I mean, what you see is what you get. And
As you can tell from this podcast.
it's messy and it's fun and it's light and it's always pointing you back to the Lord. And so, yeah, I mean, like I said, Jeff just gave you a big old box with a bow on it and said, "Go lead the crazies."
Takes one to know one.
Absolutely.
Takes one to lead one.
Yeah.
Touche.
So, kind of take a trip in the Wayback Machine. As you're continuing working your recovery program and you're going through your inventory process, and I know that you've done multiple, and every time you do it, you find something else to add to it and all of that. It's a never-ending list. It's the gift that keeps on giving. But to kind of go back, and this is the part where I say, go back as far as you want to go, but growing up in your formative years and your young adulthood and all of that, like what are some experiences that you think kind of contributed to the path that you took that led you into recovery?
Well, in my family, there was always alcohol around, and it wasn't that people were hanging out getting drunk, but there was, like in my parents' house, there were 2 liquor cabinets, and my dad always had a drink at 6:30 at night. He had a martini, and at 10:30 at night, he had what they called back then a highball.
Oh,
A highball.
what is that?
Yeah. Bourbon with a little bit of soda.
There you go.
Lots of ice. And so alcohol was a normal part of my upbringing. But I never really saw people obliterated or anything, but it was just a normal part. We would go to parties with my parents and all their friends and their kids, and it was always alcohol. The adults were always on alcohol. But I think if you're asking like what were some of the things that made me pick up alcohol, or that, well, one, I started out as a teen, my senior year of high school, drinking, just to have fun and do things of that nature. But I really feel like, and this was through the amends process or the inventory process that I realized that my father was a family physician his whole life. He, well-known, had high standards. And although those standards weren't really spoken, you just knew that they existed. And I felt that, and I was the youngest of 5. So by the time it got to me, it was kind of like, whatever, number 5. And I felt as though, and that I never really lived up to his expectations. That was never communicated to me, but that was something that I felt that I never had lived up to his expectations. And I think one of the other things is, so I kind of took that as, well, I'm never going to live up to his expectations, so I might as well do what I want to do, And the other thing is my dad, he was a really hard worker. He had his own private practice for years and years and years. And when my dad was, when I was young, and my dad was in practice, it was you worked long hours. He made house calls. People came to our house. It was nothing for somebody to ring our doorbell and be like, "Oh, is Dr. Zettler here? So and so sick," and like our living room would be this makeshift examining room, but
living room clinic.
Yeah, living room clinic, of course. But it was more or less that, like I said, he was a great provider. However, he wasn't involved a lot physically or emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of that was his career. Back in those days when I was growing up, doctors, you were 24/7. You made although one thing that we always did together was every night we'd have dinner at 6:30, family meal, all 5 of us kids sitting around the kitchen table. With mom and dad having dinner, and we would always do family vacations 2 weeks at a time every summer. But I think it was the interim of things where there was a missing piece for me.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about the love in step study. We talk about, the love of your earthly father, the love of your heavenly father. How do they compare? How do they contrast?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there were a lot of things where I was looking for love in all the wrong places to fill that. And whether that was through drugs, alcohol, or boys.
Somebody should write a song about that.
I know. Maybe
looking for love in all the wrong places.
Yeah.
So when did Randy and you and Randy meet?
Randy and I have known one another since 2nd grade, and we went to grade school together. And then he ended up moving away in 6th grade to the west side of town. We lived on the east side of town. Then Randy moved to the west side of town. So 6th to 8th grade, we all hung out in a group of friends together. But then back in high school, Randy and I were in our high school class, but I always say I was never cute enough for him, and he always dated other girls. But yeah, and so
Randy, you dog.
I know, daggone. I think he was blinded back then.
Listen, the Lord will blind you until the right time.
Yes. So anyway, so we've been friends since 2nd grade. We've always been friends, hung out in the same group of friends. And then after high school, we lost touch. And actually, he dated the same girl pretty much all through high school. I attended his wedding, his first wedding. I attended the second one too.
The one that counts.
Yeah. But anyways, and I lost touch with him, but someone did invite me as a guest to his wedding, and I went, of course, anything for a party. And then I hadn't seen him until our 10-year high school reunion. And I ran into him there, and he was actually going through a divorce, and I had just gotten out of a relationship. So we hung out under the pretense that we really didn't want anything, and here we are 32 years later, married.
That's how they get you.
Yeah, that's how they get you.
If there's ever a place to meet somebody, it's your 10-year high school reunion.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Well, hopefully by then, I can't. If that's your plan, I think the plan would be like, well, after 10 years, they get all the stupid out. But as I think what we're going to, as spoiler alert, I don't think that happened with you guys.
No, we had a few years left in us.
Right. So as far as when you guys, where was your using at? Let's say up to the point as you and Randy met, where was your kind of using career at that point? Quote,
I was pretty much a drinker.
Yeah.
Yeah. I might smoke a little bit of pot here and there, but pretty much of a drinker. Yeah.
But probably, I'm assuming at this point, probably would you say you were a functioning addict, or were you just kind of in what we might call like the abuser status of like maybe you partake more than you should? But
I was definitely abusing alcohol.
Yeah.
Yes.
And at what point did things start to really spiral for you?
It was probably I think drinking. I feel like there was that imaginary line with alcohol that I crossed. And looking back on it, I know I crossed an imaginary line, but as I was doing it, I had no idea. Sure. And I would drink. I feel like, it was almost, I was dependent on it. I couldn't wait to get off work so I could drink. And then that led to going to lunch with my, with some of my coworkers, and we'd have a beer or two and then end up not going back to work because my schedule was flexible, not as flexible as I made it, but there was some flexibility.
You found some extra bin.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was salary. And I was on call 24/7. I was running a group home. And so anyways, and then it progressed from, after work to lunch, and to the point of where when I finally quit drinking, as through an ultimatum from Randy, I was drinking in the morning before I would go to work. I'd get up in the morning and drink a cup of decaf coffee and a cup of beer, and the other one I had 2 mugs. Twisted.
Man, it's crazy, like the rituals we find ourselves in with using.
Yeah.
And so
absurd.
So as for you, like I know rock bottom was obviously what we already addressed was the false positive, but what got you in the point that you even started working recovery? Like what was kind of like your moment of clarity that made you realize that, hey, I need to start going to meetings, find a sponsor?
Yeah, so you're talking way back in 1993, right? Well, Randy had given me an ultimatum that he said that if I didn't want to get help, that was fine, and he would pack my bags and have me leave. Or he would go. What was the choice? And so that was one night because, of course, there was a lot of deception going on as far as, oh, hey, I'll be home for dinner and show up 4 hours later if I came home at all. And it was just all I was out drinking. And so he had given me an ultimatum that I needed to quit drinking. And I remember that night that he gave me that, I laid on the couch, curled up in a ball in the fetal position all night. And I'm thinking, okay, I can do this. I'll go to AA. I knew some people in recovery already, some friends that had gotten sober. And so so the next day I told him, I said, hey, I'm going to go to AA. He's like, no, you need more than going to AA. You need a program. And so I don't know what made me do it. I think the fear of losing him and our relationship, my marriage, is that I called a friend of mine and said, hey, I need to get sober. And I said, my husband says I need to go to a program. And she was like, okay, get ready. I'll be over to get you. And as a matter of fact, I drank a beer before I got in the shower to get ready.
One last hoorah.
My last hurrah. And so actually she had driven me to, it was on the west side of Cincinnati, a treatment facility that to do an assessment that day. And they did an assessment and said, hey, you could benefit from our outpatient program. So I started doing an outpatient program through, and I forget the name of the place. Geez, that was April 8th, 1993.
So through the your outpatient program, you're going, and then are you also attending AA meetings?
Yeah, as part of the outpatient program was 4 days a week, 4 nights a week, 6 to 8, so I could still work. And then another requirement was 3 AA meetings a week.
So you're going through that, and how long of a process was that?
The program was 6 weeks and 4 nights a week, and then 3 AA meetings.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then, so what is the timeline between kind of your initial engagement with working a program through that and the legal trouble that you found yourself in that eventually led to where this podcast started?
With the cocaine,
Yeah.
with my possession charge, there was 12 years.
12 years.
Yeah, so I had 12 years.
So you hadn't been drinking.
Nope.
You're
No
like, hey,
drinking.
cocaine's cool. No Miller Lite for me. Pass me that 8-ball.
Yeah. Yeah. So I would snort cocaine and drink Diet Right because it didn't have any calories and no caffeine and no sodium.
Gotta watch that
you gotta keep
sodium.
that poison out of your body.
I know.
All natural nose candy though, perfectly good. Isn't it crazy? Like, I mean,
It's insane.
It's got to be because there are people listening to this podcast who don't struggle with addiction, and it's been kind of wild. Like the people that have come up to me and said, "Hey, I listened to your podcast," and I'm like, you did? Like not, it's just, I didn't think about it. I just put it out to the world and whoever listens. But I'm like, there got to be times that we laugh about these things that they're like, I don't know if I'd be laughing about that. But it's like,
it's so true.
You have to.
yeah, I mean,
You
yeah,
have
I mean,
to, yeah.
because you're laughing at the insanity of it, right? Like
Absolutely.
you're like, a lot of it for me is like, I'll think back on the things that I've done and I'm like, what in the world possessed me to think that was okay?
Yeah.
Like,
No reason that any of it was okay. However, it was a good idea in my mind
right.
at the time.
That's right. Mitch has a saying that, like when we're in addiction, we're in an echo chamber. All of us. There's a level of this either actual isolation, like in my case, or kind of this mental isolation that you only associate. When you're using, you tend to only associate yourself with people who are going to agree with you. So other addicts, people that you party with, whatever. And so, because you don't want to hear somebody tell you the truth. And so you're in this echo chamber. And when you're in that echo chamber, Mitch says, when you're in the echo chamber, all of your dumb ideas feel like Einstein level genius.
Yes.
And the reason why in recovery that community is so important, and I just shared this in the open group that we had this morning, was that like I need these groups, I need the conversations I have with other people in recovery, because if not, then I get stuck in that echo chamber and my dumb ideas start sounding really smart.
Right.
And that's where I get in trouble.
Yeah.
And so
you start trying to cure self with self.
right. Yeah.
It doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah. If you find somebody who ever figured out how to do that successfully, I'd like to meet them. I haven't met them yet. But so you mentioned you get picked up with a possession charge, and that's what starts your kind of legal process.
Absolutely.
Time in the legal system.
Yes.
And so when you got, so like, what was the moment of clarity for you was it when you got picked up that like you're like, oh, like I'm an addict and I can't do cocaine either. Like I just can't do these things. Like what was the point that
I kept using.
Okay.
I was going to beat the system.
Yeah.
She said, hold my beer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to beat the system.
Hold my diet right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So walk us through what that looked like, because I'm sure that's just a time of just pure chaos and insanity for
Oh,
you.
it was absolutely insane. Looking back on it, I haven't thought about it in such a long time, but now that you're asking me, yeah, I honestly believe I thought like, oh, I can beat the system. I'm like, so I got busted with a little bit of cocaine. And
Who doesn't? Like, who hasn't, right? Like,
yeah. Well, much to my surprise, it was not good. Yeah, excuse me. I had an attorney. Oh, geez. And the attorney was, giving me sound advice. But of course, I was like, nah, I don't need to do those things to, you know, to fight this charge. However, I really at that time it was self-will run riot. Yeah, I was doing everything in self-will, and ended up going to court, my first court appearance, and probation. I was doing. I was. The judge gave me in lieu of conviction. So if I met X, Y, and Z, all these X, Y, these certain requirements, that I wouldn't have a conviction, possession charge on my thing. Well, like I really followed through with any of the things. Yeah. I mean, I still kept using. I was just like, they'll never find out. Well, of course, when you get called in to do random drug screens, they find out real quick.
Right. I'll be fine. They'll never know. Pee in this cup.
Yeah.
And so what was your moment of clarity like in all of that, where you were like, I can't do this anymore? Because I know you said before you had your spiritual awakening, you had started to do the right thing. So what happened that made you realize I need to take this serious? Like, I have a problem, and two, I need to take this seriously.
Well, prior to going to the recovery pod 16, 17. Prior to that, I had been in a residential program through Hamilton County, through drug court. And it's when I went to residential program is that I knew that it was serious and I had to quit. Yeah.
Man, so that led you through that. And so, sorry, I have a question that I'm trying to formulate in my mind. And I lost it. Okay. The dog is barking in my head now instead of in the hall.
That darn dog.
Man, for those who, let's speak to the people who are new in recovery for a moment. Let's put that hat on. Let's look through that lens. As we've gone through the process through this podcast of talking about your past, and you're kind of thinking back on the insanity and the chaos and how difficult it was, and all of that. What is your word of advice to somebody who's starting, who maybe, let's do it this way. Let's say that instead of me sitting across from you right now, there is you when you're starting recovery. Let's say this is the day after your spiritual awakening. So your second day in the recovery pod. If you could sit down across from that Carol, what would you say to that Carol?
Oh, Matt, you're making me think. I would say that there's freedom, there's hope in Jesus Christ.
I don't think there's any more words that need to be said than that. And I feel like, man, that's such a good story. And thank you for doing this, by the way. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
Is there anything that you have, Natalie? Anything?
No, Carol does a great job of accepting someone in their chaos.
Mhm.
And so you might not have had the words to say to what Carol in day 2 of pod would have, but what I've seen you say to others and what you've said to me is that you're worth it. And I think that's the root of it is realizing and it's an investment, and you invest in people, and it's worth investing in yourself. So
Yeah, and I'm going to kind of
And
add
you're
that,
worthy.
mhm.
Yeah, you're worth it and you're worthy.
yeah, and just to take a moment to kind of speak my appreciation for you, because I feel like it's important. Again, for those of you listening, Randy and Carol are they lead the Celebrate Recovery here at the Village, and they're such a they're pillars of what this has become, and the impact, and I mean, countless people. I feel like, I mean, it's not literally countless, but it feels countless, the amount of people that have come in here and found freedom. And for you two to have the willingness and the openness to be a part of this. And it's funny, I'm talking, as we're talking about these things we appreciate about you, I'm thinking about this, and I'm kind of thinking about Randy too. I'm like, I feel like this would make him so uncomfortable because you guys, there's no part of you guys that says, like, we want to be told about how good we are, but what you do provide is that I know even when I didn't want to be there, you were always right there, like, hey, Mr. Matt, and like, there's some part of me that's like, no matter how much of just a miserable jerk that I felt that day, there's part of me that's like, all right, Carol, like, all right, I guess I'm kind of glad to be here. Like,
I remember telling you after you had celebrated one of your anniversaries, like, hey, Matt, I was your biggest fan and you didn't even know it.
But for what you and Randy have done, I know that for speaking for Natalie and I, that you're a part of what saved our marriage. You're part of what was an example for me when I was out using. You're one of the people that I thought about that made me have faith in recovery when I wanted to write it off. In fact, when I thought about you guys and all of the people, I'm not going to mention the list again, but my kind of examples of recovery, I wanted to write off recovery because I wanted to give up completely, and I couldn't, because I couldn't deny that Carol is insane, and there's no way that she got sober on her own. And like, I say that tongue in cheek, but I, having heard your story and Randy's story and everybody else's, and I just know that I just knew that I'd have to step into an entire level of delusion that more than I already was in, to even attempt to discredit the power
correct,
of what God had done in your life through Celebrate Recovery. And so we appreciate you and love you. And like, when I started the podcast, you were one of the first people I thought of. There was kind of a list that I have in my phone that of people, like, these people need to be on, because I want people to hear their story. But even beyond your story is the impact you've had of just how you welcome people when they walk through the door, and the words that you speak, and of encouragement. And you have this infectious enthusiasm that every time I see you, when I walk in, no matter how crappy my week has been up to that point, like, it's just a charge, and that's such a gift. And I want to make sure that I verbalize that, let you know that we appreciate you. So
you're a magnet.
Yeah. And
it's not me.
It's what God does through you. But,
exactly.
But hey, you were fearfully and wonderfully made, Carol. So,
well, thanks for having me, Matt and Natalie. It's been great having Natalie as well. The two of
Natalie
us.
did great. I'm gonna clap for Natalie. And I hope that we'll see how she feels after this, whether she wants to continue to be a part of it, but I hope she is. And because there are plenty of other ladies in recovery that I want to hear their stories and have them on. So for those of you listening, please check out the other podcast episodes. Also, if you are listening on Facebook, please go to the recovery page, like, and follow the page. That helps out a ton as far as visibility. And if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe and turn on those notifications, leave a comment, like, all of that stuff. not for my ego, just because the algorithms of these different platforms really like engagement, and there might be somebody that needs to hear this, that it pops up on their YouTube feed. As far as Amazon, Apple, and Spotify, subscribe, like, rate, all those things. I feel awkward talking about all this, but and the main thing is just it's a way to support if you want to support. So
well, listen, it's hard enough to talk about your story. Then you're going to put it out on a public platform. So the reason that people agree to be on here is to share their story as a hope for others. So, be codependent and do it for someone else.
Don't be codependent, but do it for somebody else.
Yeah.
So thank you guys for listening, and I'll catch you on the next one. Bye.